So I'll start also. Where should I? Oh, nice. Okay, Pedro, do you want to take the lead? Should I start sharing?
Can you just share your screen?
Okay, I'll do it right now. Okay. Just a sec. This. Yeah. Okay, I'll share it right now. Are you seeing it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Can you do the Control F5, the present, so that it's full screen?
Let's apresentar here.
Oh yeah, cool. So I thought that this is like, it's I think the first note from the text. I thought it was pretty funny because like it renders a lot of Mark Wilson's questions like so clear in a sense, because a lot of his work comes just from this sort of like real applied mathematical work, rather than sort of like, you know, armchair philosophizing it. And I think a lot of the sort of like insights that he brings through this work, and since like physics, since Wandering Significance, are really like very much connected to the practice of like real things in the world. So so as we understand it, yeah, you can move on.
Yep.
As we understand it, like his central thesis is basically this: is like the idea that by sort of like investigating real applied mathematical work, you can sort of see these sort of like cognitive strategies to render thought computationally tractable, right? Like there's a lot of discussion, I think, in philosophy of the mind, but also in just like the history of philosophy of how we think and how we operate, and as like cognitive agents. And I think a lot of his work is really focused on making the sort of like the mechanics of this thinking visible, and but kind of starting from this very much applied panorama, but also seeing how this sort of maps onto like ordinary language philosophy, or the sort of like pragmatically oriented philosophy of language, right? Like he because I think that something that initially motivated me to look into his work is like this very like simple idea that it's present on Wandering Significance, which is sort of, I don't know if he puts it as a critique of inferentialism, but it's basically the idea that like it's not computationally tractable for everything's meaning to depend on everything else's meaning, right? Like there's this sort of like this web of inferential relations in language, and to sort of like idealize the meaning of these terms as being dependent on all the other terms in the language meaning would be completely impractical, right? Like it would be impossible for us, like corporified agents, to use language. So like for me, this is a really like important remark in sort of trying to think through like my work, which is sort of like situated, like a situated philosophy of the mind, so to speak. And I thought that this is sort of like a really important, like a really key insight that sort of makes it, that sort of like unlocks a very specific view that I think that my work defends.
Yeah, just to add a little bit about that, I think Yeah, as a, if that is a critique of inferentialism, I don't think it really has traction, because I really don't think uh, holism in the sense of inferentialism presupposes the totality of language in order to function, right? They need they actually, you just need a few of the inferences in place in order to start using concepts. And it is a part and parcel of inferentialism that you don't really know everything that follows from the concepts that you use. This is a historical process of sorting out the meaning of the terms that you use. So you don't really have ready hand, like ready made, at hand, uh, all the associated meanings of the terms that you are navigating with, in a sense, right? So I actually think Wilson is pretty compatible with inferentialism. First, he's also in Pittsburgh. He's informed by this kind of pragmatics, this kind of philosophy of language, pragmatics oriented, right? But in a sense, he's also much more Wittgensteinian than Sellers and Brandon and the folks that we have been talking about in the presentation on Justin Evans, Capital as Space of Reasons, and all of that. I think he's much more localized. And what I think is a novelty here is the fact that he thinks there is a mutual illumination. You can illuminate the workings of natural language in a sense by looking at the conceptual strategies at place in the use of applied mathematics in certain engineering problems mainly, or micromechanics and things like that. And also, conversely, you can understand what is at stake in the strategies used to build a coherent model out of, for instance, a complex multi-layered material by looking at the forms of navigation we can take in our also multi-layered, so to speak, language games, in a sense. So there's this kind of ability to map one to the other, in a sense, right? Which is quite interesting. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. No. Like I just wanted to say this real quick is that I don't think it's like necessarily a criticism, but I think it's like a nuance that needs to be brought into to the sort of work of like naturalizing inferentialism in a robust and like computationally feasible way, right? Like in a way that it can be modeled. Something that we originally had here, but we don't have it anymore, is this the little thing about game semantics. Can you recall what it was, JP? Because I think that in sort of this,
I don't really remember.
in this,
Was it something that you put in and we took
no,
out? Yeah.
no, you put it in because it was about Hintika and
Oh
like
yeah, yeah,
Trotsky's friend. I forgot his name.
yeah. Jaco Hintika and Jean van
Jan van Heindorn.
Eisenhower. Yeah. The Trotsky's secretary. Yeah. Yeah. The thing about, yeah, I was kind of avoiding this subject actually, but okay, we can just very quickly just gloss over it, which is that strange difference between languages calculus and languages universal medium, which was what there was a slide about this, right? In the sense that I think this is quite illuminating for reading certain approaches of philosophy in the 20th century. For instance, there is a very interesting book about Husserl and Heidegger, which is very far away from what we are studying here, but which associates Husserl and Heidegger to each one to a different kind of understanding of language. Either Husserl as language as calculus, and Heidegger as a language as universal medium. The point is that with language as a universal medium, you can't really talk about language. This is the main result, right? While language as calculus, you can have this kind of localized approach where you can have like localized semantics that has to do with certain certain layers of experience or whatever, right? And you can actually examine the semantic relationships that obtain there. But I don't remember really the game semantics aspect of it. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, Peter.
Yeah, well, we'll just save this for whenever I'm doing a presentation about game semantics. But I think that this Mark Wilson's insight about the sort of like genericity or reapplicability of these reasoning strategies from a mathematical modeler standpoint to a ordinary language approach are pretty like they're pretty feasible. Like it's pretty clear, I think, in game semantics or in ludics how these would migrate from one another because they have like a particular form as an argument. So you could like understand that, you know, like the modular strategy, despite being applied to let's say like a continuum physics problem, like the structure, right, that this game, let's say that these sequence of moves builds would be reapplicable in a natural language setting. Like, right, like there's like tons of problems in trying to sort of make these two work, you know, and how to bridge the sort of the structure of certain or the structure of arguments in general over to a kind of generic structure, and then understanding the ways in which these strategies can be applied in different realms. But I think there's like really interesting contours of compatibility between the sort of like ludics and game semantics approach and his work. It's just that like he's so preoccupied with reality in a sense that it doesn't really allow for the formalization of this problem in a formal setting, right? Like he's just really concerned with analyzing it from the modeler's perspective, which I think it's yeah, it's pretty interesting, I guess. But which sort of leads us to this slide, which is really about this idea, right, of understanding these strategies of modeling really as sort of he talks about it in different places as sorts of heuristics that can be reused, and I think that like this is, we'll get into that a bit, but he kind of summarizes in very specific strategies that have like very specific end goals, which are the lessons that he kind of extracts from these problems. But can you move to the next one, JP?
Should we read the, the slides maybe? A recurring
Well,
thread
we
for
can.
yeah, is the necessity of approaching conceptual innovation in a manner that is biologically plausible and computationally feasible. We are, after all, creatures of relatively small brain, and the physical world casts descriptive opportunities our way that are varied in strategic character, with little regard for inferential limitations. You have already this problem of inferential limitations right there. Often the key to adaptive success is to find ways to re-engineer a familiar reasoning scheme A into a fresh routine that addresses task B in a swift and relatively painless manner. The results often provide significant computational advance cloaked in conceptual model, for the strategies that underpin policy B can be quite different from those that rationalize A. Sorry, yeah, this is it. So, you want to continue, Pedro? Yeah.
Yeah, can you just read, because I think that this is really
We'll go on.
sorry.
Sorry. Okay, I'll go on. Tasks that require language for the successful execution generally demand that articulated stretches of individual sentences get laid down in dialogues. This is the linguistic level at which pragmatic purpose, meaning its use, should normally display itself. But the individual sentences within those dialogues must be understood first before the purpose of the larger groupings to which they belong can be adequately recognized. 3. Parsing these component sentences in turn rests upon a foundation of lexical grasp and grammatical recursion. For these recursive processes of semantic recognition must transpire before the pragmatic purpose of a dialogue can be grasped, by which time the primary meaning of tuning sentences must be firmly locked in place. Let me
What is
just,
grammatical recursion?
yeah, I don't remember this one's, Pedro, you selected this part, right? What was this specific part
Well,
about?
I think that because I think that in this section I think grammatical recursion is just like understanding in which part, like how does this sentence mean in a structure of other sentences, right? Like how to parse this
Like this?
the meaning of these words, having in mind what is the overall like structure of the sentence. But I just want to go back to this one real quick, just because I think that when I was mentioning the thing that he, like, let's say not necessarily opposes, but like his objection to unrestricted semantic holism are sort of found in these four points, because I think that he sort of well, basically what he's sort of saying is that, like, while unrestricted semantic holism would be a sort of like top-down approach or bottom-up, but it would be like a one-directional approach. Like the process of parsing any sentence requires movements that go from like the whole sentence to each of its component words, and the sort of the relationship with the rules of the language and so on and so forth. So it's much more dynamic than the sort of like one-sided or monotonic. I don't know if that's the proper use, but in a certain sense of language. So I think he makes this sort of argument, sort of like he's sort of like demonstrating the way in which the modeling techniques work by talking about natural language, which I think it's like really the crucial bit of this text, that it's really in the beginning of the text, and like of this passage, because I think that this is really where he sort of like outlines that, like, okay, but like in the same movements that render one thing computationally feasible are the ones that render the other computationally feasible, right? Like between natural language and modeling, applied math modeling techniques. So I think that this is
Yeah,
really
I think
where
this is well,
his
yeah,
objection makes sense.
yeah, I think this is well grasped by these, for instance, these different, this zigzag, like to and fro strategy in order to plot like a bank robbery that he proposes, right? Like you have a map, and then you have a survey possible routes, so you output an optimal route. But when you are actually in the driving mode, you are always back and forth. Like you have like an overview, like you are presupposing and checking your place upon the globality that you have in mind, but also translating that into localized moves, like here I make a right and a left and things like that, which is what he calls a navigational mode, right? So this is kind of intuitively, I think the grammatical recursion has to do with this, and also the idea that you have when you are actually attacking the problem of the analysis of the analysis of the behaviors of the sublayers of a complex material. You will have to also go back and forth and like re-inject certain determinations from the lower layers into the top, into the top layer, in order to gradually optimize, right, your description, something like that. And this is of course a kind of cunning, right, of conceptual strategy. But at the same time, I think it's almost part of the ontology of language, so to speak, in the sense that you are always modulating the meanings of your expression in order to make them account to the localized in an open sense of localized, like you could be doing a multiscalar analysis, but you could also be negotiating your way in your everyday life, right? You're also always modulating between, you know, like let us say a dictionary meaning of the words and the specific grammatical meanings, grammatical in the Wittgensteinian sense of the words as pertaining to a particular language game or a particular situation that has to do. I think this Wittgensteinian bit will be quite clearer in the Gianotti actually presentation, that has to do also with the adoption of certain means of presentation, Mittel der Darstellung, within the language games, which kind of embed them in a certain scale of, you know, negotiations with the world, so to speak, something like that. Sorry.
But can you move to the next one? Because I think that the next like bits really sort of contextualize this, which is this. So just read the next few slides, which is to keep their reasoning practices within practical bounds, engineers divide the modeling task into a collection of more or less independent algorithms controlled by an external register that monitors the overarching strategic purposes to which the localized results eventually contribute. So like thinking about this as like the one in the as the one in the previous slide, right? Like that there's a sort of like, I think that's something that this is something that he does really well, which is not really explain what he's doing, but like all the time he's like kind of like just putting it in your face. Like he doesn't really say like, oh, I'm taking this one thing and trying to compatibilize with this other thing, but he's at all times really just doing it, which I think it's like a really sort of like cagey argumentative strategy, right? Like he has no really overarching project. He just like literally does what he's saying he does. So just keep reading the next slide after to keep. We follow similar policies.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, this one. Yeah, we follow similar policies of strategic guidance in everyday discourse as well, for essentially the same reasons. If we hope to understand the complicated patterns in which physical terminologies attach themselves to the world within real-life speech, we must first appreciate the remarkable linguistic efficiencies that accrue to the contextual factors we shall survey. If we lack the tools to keep track of our shifting investigative purposes, we would find ourselves unable to reason about many common forms of everyday circumstance due to their intractable complexities. And I think that, you know, thinking about wandering significance, especially there's a chapter about like scientific use concepts, right? Like as like he even uses the concept of concept as the sort of like example of his, where for us to even have like to even be able to agree on what these concepts mean and in their shifting meaning within different contexts, it's already like immense computational work to sort of like keep track of what anyone is saying when they use the word concept. And I think that he's sort of like trying to sort of like condense this idea in a very simple way as related to how we use language. Yeah, do you want to read?
Yeah, I believe that much of our everyday reasoning relies upon various forms of these pedal register compressions. Here he's using that metaphor of, you know, pedal register. Like, I'm not sure about that metaphor actually, the musical one. Like he has the three different voices in an organ score, right? And he's talking about a kind of division of labor between the voices. Like the pedal register is, you know, how to say, guarantees the harmonic identity, whereas the other voices are free to move in different velocities and different speeds and pursue a certain melodic character and all of that. So I have kind of a hard time understanding like the metaphor in that specific way, but okay, we can go along with it. So on various forms of these pedal register compressions. So the idea is that the pedal register is compressing all the information in the other voices, right? Because you have the fundamental tones there, in a sense.
If I understood, just to make sure I'm following, if I understood the text correctly, like the thing you guys mentioned, like the thing you said before is that, first of all, he's establishing this thesis that we tend to evaluate our cognitive capacities, right? And that when you start from the assumption that we have actually small brains that are constrained by all sorts of things, you start to take more seriously all the strategies that are necessary to actually reason about very complex phenomena, right? You need to get around to those things. So that's the first point, right? The second, I think,
this is the physics avoidance.
Yeah, exactly, the physics avoidance thing. The second big thing that I understand that he's saying, and I think that I remember Caron saying that it was a bit striking, that he considers himself an ordinary language philosopher because he claims that there is a continuity between this common use of language in everyday life, that it can clarify the uses of language in science and more specialized fields as well, right? So the second big theme is that not only are we more restrained and weaker in our inferential capacities, but we're also more continuous in the abilities we have to do with language, for example, robbing a bank and calculating the stress of steel on a bridge, right? So that's a second big theme, right? And one of this one of these underlying capacities that he is trying to really focus on is this capacity to kind of track the shifts in kind of context, or in the shifts in the language games, or whatever. I'm not sure what's the specific term we should use, that are allowing us to actually compress in the appropriate way and then bring together these compressed approaches together to form to capture something more complex than we could just by directly trying to treat a problem that's very complex, right?
I wouldn't say exactly the last bit. I would say it a bit different. It's not more compressed than you said. More complex, right? Or more compressed? Sorry.
Yeah,
I'm a bit tired today. I'm sorry, but but I would say a little bit different because I think the issue is he has two different issues there. First one is against what he calls theory T, theorizing, theory with a big T, like the idea that you will have like basically a theory of everything that actually is based on a specific scale that will be capable of, having all the necessary variables in place, all the necessary structures in place in order to handle, I don't know, anything, reality, really. I mean, it's a philosophical problem for him. Like theory T, like is one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is and one of the problems with theory T is that theory T obeys to a kind of an in principle clause, right? So theory T for him usually starts with, oh, in principle things work like this, and then you have a theory. So what is actually embedded, compressed in this in principle thing? This is his issue. Like what's there inside in principle? What's the grain, the specific texture of this, right? So this gets glossed out in theory T. This is one of the problems. The other problem is if you go to the other way, the opposite, and try to describe every like yeah, this would work so only for us too, like your ontological glasses, as we used to say in our class on Badiou, right? Like if you're trying to actually come up with a list of everything that's in every scale, this is just, you know, noise, really, informational noise. So you don't really get to understand the relationship between scales. You don't really get to understand the relationship between what's going on in different levels of information just by having exhaustive list of everything that's going on, and even list plus structure, right? Because the legibility of the structure itself might be only attainable in a certain scale, not to the other ones, which is one of the problems that he deals with the greediness of scale problem, right? The homogenization problem. So these are the two things that he wants to avoid, like theory, that is, I'll come up with a big theory of everything that is gloss over large swaths of information in order to make it work. And you say, in principle, things work like that, something like that. And the opposite is, okay, a very, very detailed piecemeal theorization that in the end can't really construct like a big picture, even a big picture or a localized big picture of what you're studying, right? So in order to come up with a solution to this, and to avoid both these pitfalls, he has to basically think about context and the heuristic strategies that are required in order to construct like a certain point of view, multi-scalar point of view of, you know, language use and science and everything, while at the same time not being constrained by the right amount of information that will be able to explain the relationship between layers, basically, right? I saw you asked. Sorry, I wasn't seeing the chat. You're asking about what is inferentialism. Inferentialism is basically random. You see, like the idea that the meaning of a term is the order of explanation of the meaning of a term is not first the reference and then the meaning. It's the opposite. Like it's a possible inferences the use of a term lends itself to, and in order to understand reference, you have to understand these inferences. So this is inferentialism. It's a kind of order of explanation of the way language gains traction upon the world. So it's a theory of language, really. So inferentialism is opposed to representationalism, right? For instance, great example of representationalism is Kripke's rigid designator theory and all that. Like you have a term that means the same thing in every possible word and all of that. So this would be a good example of the opposite, like representationalism, right? So the term is not really defined by a cluster of possible inferences. It's just rigidly designated. You have just a direct relationship determined by baptism, a causal relationship between the use of a term and a thing in the world.
Okay,
so just to clarify.
Sure. The reason why I asked about if I was following the basic ideas is just because when you get to the analogy with music there and pedal tones and things like this, it seems he's suggesting that these bass tones are establishing the contextual harmony for what's going on.
Yeah, I think right? His idea. Yeah.
But it's interesting because if you take that, not as an analogy but as an actual application, right, where like having the tonal space defined is like defining the context, and then modulations are like marking the shifts between tonal contexts.
I mean, you're defending the metaphor.
No, I'm trying to understand if it's like a metaphor or if it's an application of the idea to music. Like
it's a good defense. I think it's a metaphor. I think it's a metaphor because, you know, it's the pedal tones are not always with that same. They don't have always that same function of affirming, you know, tonality and all that. Of course, typically they have, but not always. So I think
yeah, that would be an in principle argument, right? I mean, it's not.
Yeah, it is an in principle. If you take it too seriously, it is an in principle argument, something like that. So
yeah, but I mean, in the example that he gives, it's pretty.
Yeah.
No, but yeah, I didn't want to like take it on a different course. It's just that I thought it was an interesting example. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, let me go back to sharing, sorry. So just to finish, I was reading this, and Pedro can comment upon it. I believe that much of our everyday reasoning relies upon various forms of spatial register compressions. Present-day philosophy of language could become more supple if its practitioners more warmly appreciated the substantive reductions in syntactic complexity achievable through various policies of contextual localization. So, Pedro, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something that relates to a bit what Gabriel was saying in the beginning of his question or comment. Is just that I think that for him, it's really important to sort of, because I think that in a weird way, what he's doing is just saying that like what, you know, like the way that inferentialism explains itself lends itself to this sort of like purity sort of explanation, and for him it's really important to sort of like give the to say that contextual, like the context is what defines the scope of the possibility of like semantic localization, right? Like, is that we're constantly adjusting our expectation to the context we're in. And I think that he's really, because on the other hand, like I think what is really like striking about his work is that like there's no like systematic way, and he talks a bit about Austin in the text, and sort of like, you know, brings up some criticisms of Austin's lack of systematicity, and Wittgenstein as well, I think. That, but what he's doing is just saying that like, well, actually, like we don't really have any hopes of doing any kind of systematic work, because we just we can't really delimit, like we have to sort of have this sort of ground upon what everything rests, and we just can't have this. So the best that we can do is like sort of glue local contexts together, and to sort of like come up with a strategy that is somehow like akin to the one that he describes later on. And I think that this is really like interesting, and to sort of go back to this idea is that like maybe it's not that like in organ music it does, but in this example that he gives it does, and so that's all that matters. And I think that this is like a really nice encapsulation of his argument, so to speak, is that like, well, it doesn't matter all organ music because we're looking at this one, and this one has like a particular strategy that we're trying to replicate over these other modeling domains, so to speak. So I think it's a nice sort of like a nice little like note to have, that it sort of does, and like it's kind of ambiguous as to what it does, but thinking about it through this perspective, it sort of makes a little bit more sense, I guess. Yeah, should we keep going?
Yeah. So accordingly, pragmatics, in the robust sense of practical objectives, gains its place at the table through the manners in which our registrations of investigative strategy enhance our other linguistic capacities with respect to both data and reasoning compression. There's a typo there. To be sure, these considerations will scarcely exhaust all of the ways in which the rough slogan "meaning is use" captures valuable insights into workings of language. However, the strategic factors upon which we will focus are totally systematic in their contours, and their rudiments can be acquired within our earliest days of linguistic instruction. Yeah, I think this is more of the same, right? We can just...
Yeah, it's just that something, just wanted to clarify something real quick, is that he's talking about Fodor in this part, because there's this, like, I'm not super familiar with Fodor's work, but but what I get from the text is basically that, like for Fodor, these strategies have to be learned super quick in order for them to be effective, which is sort of maybe a similar criticism to the idea that you have to know all the rules of a language game in order to participate on it. And there's like really different ways of thinking about it, so that this is not really a question, right? Especially thinking about the learnability of it. But I think that this is really what he's trying to sort of tackle, because in a weird way, what he's saying is that like we already know these modeling techniques, and the applied math work only highlights them. And I think that
like maybe
this
makes explicit in a sense. It explicitates.
Yeah, exactly.
In a sense, it's quite. This is quite striking. A quite striking observation, because, in a sense, it accords with the function of logical vocabulary in inferentialism. For instance, like it makes explicit what is already going on in a certain language game, and by making it explicit, it becomes also a certain other language game, right? So you can practically elaborate that into other things, which is quite striking. Yeah. Regarding the Fodor reference, there is also an additional thing, is that Fodor, if I remember correctly, in that part of the text is saying that in order for you to know how, you have to know that, in a sense. Like there's this difference between knowing how and knowing that, right? Knowing that is usually thought of as propositional knowledge. Like I know that it is raining right now. Like I'm stating a fact. So I know a certain set of facts, right? I know that, this and that. And Fodor, and he's saying that in order to know how to do things, you have to know that things are such and such. This is the basic Fodor defense of what he thinks is the Cartesian way of putting things. I think Wilson is kind of making a polemic against this, in a sense, like talking about the pragmatics place at the table, in a sense, like actually you already know how to navigate, in a sense, in language use. And this goes hand in hand with knowing that. It's not like you have the list of how the world is in order to navigate it, right? So basically, this was what I took to be the basic polemic there in that defense of pragmatics that Wilson is making. So the range of size skills that we must tie together in assembly a composite story of modeling certain effects is clearly tremendous. Engineers often call the resulting obstacles to effective computation the tyranny of scales problem, or the greediness of scales. Such examples vividly display the great advantages of partitioning a descriptive practice into an integrated network of localized tasks focused upon achievable strategic goals. Reasoning tractability represents a constraint upon linguistic practice every bit as vital as the systematic learnability that cognitivists emphasize. Here is the systematic learnability that you were making reference to, right, from Fodor.
Yeah, I think we can keep going.
Yeah, there's a lot of things. So this was his nice example of robbing a bank, and you'll always so the text in highlights is saying that there are two different modes, right? A topographic mode and the piloting mode. So there's a topographic mode that says at the corner of Market and Honolulu, wait a few minutes, I'll be right in front of you, the piloting mode, right? So you're already, by doing like a simple, so to speak, task of robbing a bank, which is not so simple after all, you already navigating between two different modes of seeing what's going on, in a sense, right? Or of expressing what is to be done, in a sense. A topographic mode that is localizing what you're doing within a certain map, within a certain totality, a localized global totality, and the piloting mode that is, saying or suggesting how to move from your localized point of view, in a sense. Wait a few minutes, I'll be right in front of you. So you have a point of view in that map. So you shift between all the time between the topographic and the piloting mode in order to get the task done. So this is the shifting of investigative focus that he references a lot in the text. For instance, certain verbal formulations as let us see what happens when such and such, right? So this is the devising of certain counterfactual situations, for instance, all of this. So he's making the case that there is a kind of course technique of modeling at place already in the proper heuristics of natural language, in a sense. So in this manner, our tacit awareness of current investigative purpose affects the manner in which we parse a simple question. I find it striking that we make such adjustments in our everyday thinking extremely swiftly without overtly noticing that we have done so. In the pages ahead, any sequential succession of shifting investigative strategies of this ilk will be called the cognitive architecture. Accordingly, the architecture of our bank robbery plotting, that's a simple two-stage process. The multi-stage arrangements, which we'll investigate in the pages ahead, are more complicated, involving various feedback interconnections between different computational stages. You want to add something here, Pedro?
No, we can keep going.
So here we get to this RVE business. I selected these two illustrations from the book, like the incredible shrinking, the story of the incredible shrinking man, and he's illustrating it with different photographs taken from the film, wherein the guy gets shrinked, and there's this filming and this different scalings, different relationships from his size and the background and all that, in order to go on with the narration of multiple scales. So, which is a kind of simple, really, example. And then he compares that to the incredible shrinking steel, right? So the incredible shrinking steel, you have the piece of steel, and then you have like 3 different stages which looks the same, and then things start to get weird, right? So where things start to get weird is when you have to really go into specific scales. So you have these RVE levels, like representative volume element, that in a sense represents it's representing the heterogeneous behavior of a certain level of analysis in a certain material, right? So it is already a kind of heuristics, in a sense. What's striking about this, it is already a kind of heuristics, but then you have to come up whenever there is, for instance, a difference in behavior in the material. For instance, it is an isotropic material at first, and in a certain layer, it becomes anisotropic. So you're registering a change of behavior. Of course, this behavior of the material is always responsive to a certain stimulus, right? So you apply pressure to it and you see how it reacts. Then you will, whenever there is kind of non-identity between, the kind of reactions you get, you'll have to come up with a certain RVE in order to represent the specific level you're dealing with, or represent the specific behaviors, the typical behaviors of a specific level, right? So all these RVE levels interact in complex ways, and in a naive attempt to capture the behavior of a mundane piece of railroad steel in bottom on molecular terms generates an impossible descriptive overload. So, of course, this is also a theme that is coming up a lot in these meetings of ours, the kind of cost, right? The cost of certain descriptions of certain, which one is more costly and then the other, certain economics of description, so to speak, or of theory. So the multiscalar models of this essay evade these obstacles by implementing an allocation of linguistic tasks akin to that employed within a sweatshop assembly line. Working from the macroscopic scale downward, a multiscalar scheme decomposes its modeling efforts into bite-sized pieces of achievable chore involving submodels linked to specific RVE size scales. These submodels concentrate entirely upon the locally dominant behaviors, normally witnessed at the appropriate RVE level, leaving the job of tracking smaller disturbances, such as dislocation pileup, to other submodels. So dislocation pileup will be I don't know if you guys took a look at to the essays that I sent. It's a big theme here, like this dislocation pileup, which is which if is yielding a kind of a permanent effect is called hysteresis, right? Hysteresis, don't know how it exactly is, I don't know. So through this division of descriptive labor, each submodel can perform its computational duties in a tractable manner involving a moderate number of descriptive parameters. Multiscalar method assembles a hierarchy of separate submodel computations in this localized manner and scrutinizes their outputs for self-consistency. Corrective interscalar adjustments are introduced as needed until an overall descriptive accord is reached. A corrective process that may need to run through many iterations. So this is also another example of the recursive grammar, right? By simplifying descriptive task in this layered manner, tremendous reasoning compression can be achieved. So I think there is some observation in the chat bar. I'm not seeing it because I am sharing.
Just an explanation of what RV is from the text. The quote.
Yeah. Implies standard scientific. Yeah, this is also in another slide. So, Pedro, do you want to comment?
But yeah, I just wanted to say that what he says in the end, towards the end, about self-consistency is sort of very key to what I think it's in the middle of the lessons, which is homogenization. And if you like thinking about, I didn't really catch last week's all the meeting, but in thinking about the problem of scales in sort of more like in fundamental physics, the idea of self-consistency comes up a lot in thinking about stuff like renormalization groups and effective field theories and things of that nature. Like maybe if we have time in the end, we can sort of talk a little bit about this, because I think that it's also something that it's like a big part of the interest, I think, in his perspective, but it's not really obvious in the way that he approaches. But in earlier, like in the fifth essay of the book of physics avoidance, which is called The Tyranny of Scales, have been, like it's not called The Tyranny of Scales, but there's like a previous version of this text that was in Robert Batterman's book about philosophy of physics from Oxford, that it talks a lot about renormalization in the context of these same examples. So I was just looking at it like earlier, like just before this, and it reminded me of a lot of this discussion of the importance of homogenization for the sort of like more, let's say, like theory T physics, which is something that I think it's like a nice bridge between last week, this week, and sort of like different reasons to be wary of scales.
I was gonna say also this picture, the steel picture especially, reminds me very much last week, like what we were talking about, the resolution ranges, right?
Yeah,
there's like a certain homogeneity through a range of scales at which it's consistent.
Yeah,
and then it breaks down.
I tend to think it's different, but we'll get to that, because I don't really have the mathematical savvy to understand it. But I tend to think there's something very different about it, because, well, I can maybe advance a bit, which it has to do with the fact that he said you can't really come up with a discretized model for each layer, because you're using differential equations that that has to go all the way down, right? If you stop at the scale, in a sense, if you don't use, let me show the, I don't really have the vocabulary today, really sorry about that, but there is something about this which I found very striking. I wanted to understand it really, which is this problem. Like, we can actually go up. Yeah, no, I'll go back to that. But which is this problem really? I mean, why does any of this present with us with philosophical worries? At first glance, we might presume that our greediness problem can be rectified by simply replacing our differential equation models with truncated versions that eschew all of the excessive lower scale details within each delta L centered modeling, right? The result would be a discretized collection of data posed on at the lowest length scale, retaining descriptive validity on a delta L basis. Why, after all, do we need to express our delta L-centered knowledge in the infinitesimal guise of a differential equation? Why not cut off this unwanted extension and confine our claims to what happens in little blocks at the delta L level and above? Mathematically, this proposal recommends that the continuous solutions to our differential equation should be replaced by broken line plots, which more accurately encapsulate the discrete data that we actually possess about our material on the relevant RVE level. The consequences of such a cutoff policy would prove inferentially disastrous, because profitable reasoning pathways must travel through these infinitesimal levels of description in order to reach worthy conclusions. This is a familiar aspect of viable mathematical reasoning. The inferential pathway that connects A to B often runs through unexpected intermediate territory C methodological observation that periodically appears within these pages. So the problem is, if you come up with a discretized version, the Fourier transform that you will use will be completely messy. So in order to use the Fourier transform, you will have to use the differential equations that, in a sense, in their ontological commitments, so to speak, are hogging all the way down to the scales that actually are non-identical to what the equation itself is describing, the behavior the equation itself is describing. I'm not sure if I made myself clear, but this is something that I'm interested in, and maybe Yash and people who are more mathematically savvy have something to say about this.
Yeah, no, I wanted to ask, wait, did you say that when you take this discretized approach, just Fourier transforms in general in your differential equations don't work out well? That makes sense. I mean, because what a Fourier transform is just breaking down a function into a sum of sine functions. Yeah. So it's breaking up into oscillate.
Yeah. But it's quite. I think it's, for me, it's quite. It's already quite intuitive, because you will have to have a gap. Kind of,
it takes infinitely many sine functions to make these like discretized, very like, choppy kind of graphs. So it's going to make it difficult.
I didn't understand where this is going against.
I don't see why it's relevant exactly.
Yeah, it seems that, I mean, it's perfectly fitting to what Natal was doing. I didn't understand, like, the point where you, I mean, there is something that I want to talk about that I feel like it's not really a conflict, but it's something I just like to see, like, how you guys approach it, but with a separate matter. But on this particular point, if you could just explain a bit better how you see the contradiction, because perhaps we also didn't present Natal clearly enough because I get the feeling that it's very much in the same direction.
I don't think I really have the problem is I don't really think that I have the mathematical problem to locate it really. Actually, it has to do with the relinquishing of the differentiability, so to speak.
Yeah.
Is this equivalent to adopting a gappy version?
No, it's the opposite. Because, I mean, it's the opposite. The idea is that the most general theory doesn't have that as a fundamental hypothesis, but there will be parts of your scale space where differentiability holds. So it's a theory to establish the underlying continuity between the scales, right? It's scale relativity means that there is a continuous of scales. and not a theory of scale gaps. Scale gaps are a consequence, not the fundamental.
Well, it's not a scale gap. You see, the problem is, yeah, it's not a scale gap. It's the fact that you have a different set of behaviors would entail in this reasoning, this particular reasoning of Wilson's, that if you would be completely, let us say, faithful to your ontological commitments, you wouldn't be able to use differential equations, because in order for them to yield the continuous results that they yield, they would have to hog onto the lower scales that have non-identical behaviors. So you'll be in a sense describing incorrectly, so to speak, other scales in order to yield a certain set of parameters that are much more that are in turn much more computationally tractable than the gappy version. So the gap is not the gap between scales, but the gap is a result of not wanting to have like as a reference to the equation you're using, the scales that actually present different behaviors, therefore would be accurately described by a different set of equations, not the one you're using because you are at, let us say.
I think, for example, just let me give a more practical example. Like to go to engineering, right? Because Natal is way too theoretical. Like there's a lot of people working with very, very concrete engineering issues concerning, let's say, very small processors, where you have to move from more classical mechanics to, I don't know, electromagnetism and whatever, to allow for quantum effects that create noise or create some weird phenomena. Like there's a lot of engineering that happens between those things. I think like Natal would be suggesting that you can actually do exactly what Wilson says, like keep track of where you're, like, to show that it is consistent to change strategies from an engineering point of view between, let's say, describing that material or that process you're working on classically to talk about, I don't know, some processes that go into making that component, and then accounting for problems that appear with a different approach, which gives, you know, credence to quantum phenomena or whatever. And he would say, no, this is not inconsistent. There is a way to keep track of that, which just requires you to explicitate the scale dependence of these different language games or something.
Until now, you are in the same thing. Natal is saying the same thing as Wilson.
Yeah, I think the difference appears with the fact that he is trying to create a theory. Therefore, let's say he's not trying to give you the pragmatic, almost like the ethical use of language in an engineering context, but give you the picture of the world, right? A theory for how the building blocks of physics should be put together if you need these strategies to begin with. So it is, let's say, a physical theory for a world where you need those strategies, right? So it's gonna look more continuous. It's gonna put into question some generalizations, like the whole thing with differentiability. But I mean, one of the consequences of this theory is that you don't relinquish differential equations. In fact, you need to, it's all about explaining why they're so messy in practice for certain processes, right? Why this partial differential equations, that's still the method for dealing with fractal geometry, but they become very messy, and you can see more clearly the relation between that and quantum field theory. Sorry?
Let me ask you something. Does fractal geometry then also is playing like a two-stage game in a sense? You have a certain kind of math that presupposes, let us say, things that are in a sense unreal, but they are pragmatically necessary for describing a certain level. but then you have also like an infrastructure that kind of explains why you have to behave in that way in that level, something like that.
Yeah, I think that I think that the best example where I would find that is on the later chapters on quantum mechanics, where he tries to give a pragmatic description of why quantum mechanics is probabilistic. And he's saying that it's not that it's probabilistic because that's the ontological commitment we want. Like, that doesn't tell you something about the world you're living in. That's just the way you can turn this infinite fractal paths of quantum particles into something you can work with. So, right, Yasha?
I kind of see it as taking the Feynman path integral formulation kind of very literally.
Yeah.
And saying that rather than it necessarily being literally this infinite sum of paths, that in some sense there is a quote unquote true path that the particle follows that is infinitely fractal, but that's something you can never measure, right? Like, that would have an infinite length. It would require infinite energy to measure it. But that the quantum effects come about by this like fractality coming about, right?
Yeah, so you have these two methods at the same scale. Like, on the one hand, the method that truly describes the continuity between quantum mechanics and relativity is a method that emphasizes the infinite character of fractal paths. But the actual workable method is probabilistic. Yeah. So I think and again, it makes this into a positive fact of physics rather than like a dirty little secret,
Yeah.
So I don't know, I see a connection, and this brings me to the point that I wanted you guys to comment on, because one thing that I found interesting is that, he introduces this RVE, this volume elements thing, which is the most concrete thing he says about scales. Like, the only predicate he attaches to scales, like, that makes them look like scales and not like lateral moves between attributes of different ways of looking at things, but these ways are connected to scales, right? Why aren't we simply moving between ways of seeing, but they have no, let's say, spatial relation between them? They're just different ways that are relevant for different uses, right? But why are they scalar, or why are they scale dependent? It's because he attaches them to this RVE. But those RVE is the thing we're talking about, right? They are, let's say, something material that is indexing that way of speaking, that way of reasoning to a scale.
So yeah, it's like the real atom. It's like the real atom for it.
But isn't that a bit against inferentialism? Isn't that index coming before? If it is the index that makes that language game scale dependent, isn't that scale dependent something of that which you're talking about and not how you're talking about it? Right? He moves between the RVE, and then he says, when you move from one to another, you talk about things in a different way. But I cannot know from the ways of speaking that I'm speaking about different scales. They seem to be just kind of not unrelated, but related in a different way than the spatial resolution, right? So it seems like the resolution aspect of RVEs is a bit extrinsic. Like, we don't get to see, and I think that it has something to do with the fact that it doesn't really mention about the instruments or the practice of measure that is going, like, it's kind of implicit in this chapter. I know he talks about this elsewhere, but in this particular chapter, it's a bit implicit how you move between them, which is also, I think, a language game, right? There is a specific practice of shifting, like, from the kind of human perception of steel to experiments that require to put it under a microscope, from experiments that require weird testing on the material, things like this. That seems relevant to make the RVEs into something more internal to the language games of each scale, and not like a an external reference, which doesn't bother me that much. I mean, I have no problem with, with that. But how do you guys see that?
But just to sort of go back a little bit to the difference, I think, between Notal's approach and Wilson's approach, I think it's like, in the end, I don't think Wilson's approach is based on trying to solve theoretical issues that arise from the sort of from the process of measuring or describing a quantum system, right? Like he's not really he's not committed to things that they're outside the practice of modeling the system. He's like very much pragmatically oriented. So like for him, I think that the issue that Notal might be getting at, it's not even an issue. And I think that the difference in approach for me, it seems to be this one. Like it's just a difference in orientation. I think like Wilson's like way too pragmatically oriented to even consider these types of questions outside of the sort of like modeling practice that they would entail.
Yeah, but I mean, isn't the point that, I mean, is it fair to say that, I mean, because he's proposing a method that you use to learn about a piece of steel. What is the relevant information about the steel to build this bridge, right? So novelty here is engineering novelty. It's like novelty about a concrete part of the world, right? It's not novelty about knowledge about the world. That knowledge is very restricted, right? Pragmatic, in that particular sense, I understand pragmatics to mean not, let's say, a general method, but actually something that is this restricting the space of what is interesting for him, right? Which is very enriching. It's not restrictive in a bad sense, but when you say pragmatic, you mean, well, he's trying to show how engineering tasks and engineering problems mobilize reasoning in a very special way that we can learn a lot about it. But engineering and, let's say, scientific development are slightly different, right? Let's say building a new bridge between relativity and quantum mechanics is a different problem. I find it amazing that they seem to go together so far, but I wonder if...
No, I agree, because I think that at the core, because I think that both are somehow concerned with the same sort of strategies, let's say, like this sort of this idea of like homogenization being key to the problem of applied math doesn't make it, like not suitable to the problem of like the foundations of physics, right? Like I think what is like really striking is that like they are able to sort of mobilize the same apparatus in really different ways.
Yeah. But I think
towards very different purposes, I guess.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to clarify. Like, it seems to me that it's not simply that they have different approaches, therefore Wilson wouldn't even like conceive or approach things in the way Notal is doing. It seems to me that they're different objects of interest.
Yeah,
different purposes,
for sure.
And not simply that. I mean, we couldn't generalize from Wilson that he would approach problems in fundamental physics differently. Like, it seems like he's trying to show a different picture of what reasoning is from different set of problems, which are great. But
it is thinkable that he would approach fundamental physics in the same way as Notal, in a sense. Like, maybe he would stop short from coming up with a general model like fractal geometry or something like that. But it seems from what we are discussing that the reasoning paths would be pretty much the same. Like, you have to localize and try to come up with the right formalism for the right level of description and so on. So, and I think the kind of cash value of this is the fact that this has to do with a certain computational cost and also a certain heuristics. Like, if you have, as we used to say in our class about Badiou, if you put your ontological glasses on, things are actually very messy. Actually, like you're seeing multiples of multiples everywhere, so to speak. So you have to come up with ways of synthesizing this information. So the thing about inferentialism and the philosophy of language, I was thinking upon your question. I think there is a kind of misunderstanding of, that comes from the fact of maybe separating too much language, already separating too much language from its context, in a sense. Like, for instance, I don't know, we'll go back to the presentation shortly, but I mean, one of our ending slides today is like things for further elaboration, which is Gianotti. You see, like, one of the interesting things of Gianotti, that is somebody that comes from Marxism, and then actually he was the first translator of the Tractatus of Wittgenstein in '68. So it's kind of concurrent, like his Marxist phase and his Wittgensteinian. He was already studying logic and philosophy of language. But the thing that is interesting about him in his operatory scheme idea is that the atoms, let us use the Badiouian language, the atoms that, in a sense, organize a certain situation are internal to the language game. Like Wittgenstein is already predicting this, because they are the means of presentation of the rule. In order for you to have like the meter, you have to have the Parisian meter, which is an object that you take as the criterion by which you measure things at a certain scale, and a bunch of different language games follow. So I think the issue, the question of, is he's being oriented by the RVE, so it's the subject, is not so much the language. I'm not sure if this is really a problem, because you can organize a language game around a certain scale that will have a immanent criteria that will be a material thing. Language is not untethered to, of course, to material contests. So actually, we keep getting back at this, because I know there's an underlying debate about this. But my issue is not that you just need language. My issue is that you always need language. So it means you have reference, you have like a certain embedding in a certain world of material things and a bunch of processes going on, but you need to have the conceptual means of tracking these processes. So this is my basic, commitment to the language approach is this one. So it's not as if you could have language without the material thing. Like the RVE is, in a sense, a certain means of presentation, also almost in the Wittgensteinian sense of a certain game here that has to do with describing a certain material object. I don't really see a problem with that. I mean, Dennis was going to say something.
Yeah. I think to distinguish Natal from Wilson here, I think the key word is tractability, right? Because I was reading this RVE, and later on he actually introduces an RTE, a representative time element, and it seems actually what these things are actually they are approximations, right? So the difference is, Natal doesn't say like every scale has a certain approximation. He just says a scale is has some physical significance. So Natal reintroduces scale back into the structure of space-time or whatever, right? Like he's actually trying to make scale into a objective component of things.
Yeah, like time or space.
Yeah, time or space. But what Wilson is saying here is that every RTE and RVE is kind of an idealization. It's a pragmatic, not idealization, but it's a pragmatic construction that's appropriate for what language is trying to do at that scale. So it's very much like kind of a transcendental, but it's not objective necessarily. It's like engineering objective, because if you're trying to, I don't know, build a car, there are certain things you need to understand about physics, but beyond that, beyond the things you need, you can kind of abstract away everything else, right? So, you know, depending on if you wanted to like tune the car to have higher performance and so on, you have to like open up the black box, much like we did with the operads in the primer. You can like go further into an operad and open a black box and like tweak the parameters further, but you're always only scratching the surface of some potentially far more complicated structure. So the RV and the RT are just the how high of a resolution you need to go for a given task.
Yeah, for a given task, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It reminds me of, and I don't remember how explicit this is in Nathal's work, but sort of this like minimum scale resolution at which measurements at like a range of scales synthesize to agree, right? And like within that range, you get this like idea, you get sort of like mutual agreeing differentiability.
Yeah, actually, it was the point in last week's presentation that I copied the RV bit of Wilson, because it's quite striking. It seems to be the same reasoning, the same individuation criteria is going on, right? Between the two.
Yeah, I don't want to keep us away from the presentation any longer, but I think just to connect what Dennis and what Yasha had said previously and what you and Pedro said, I think that honestly, I don't see that as an issue anymore. Like, for example, in the primer, Dennis gave I think he's working in the last couple of months on a very clear connection, because the whole point is that different resolutions reorganize the semantics, right? There is something like a categorical semantics, and there is a language for that part of the world, right? And therefore, you kind of get this treatment of what is the language that goes with the resolution, right? But I think a better formulation of my question before is that, for example, you have some descriptions there of sizes of RVEs, right? But the reason why it is at that level and not another level, that the semantics changed, doesn't seem to be really part. I mean, my impression from Wilson is that perhaps this is the engineer, like what we could call the engineering embodiment, right? Look, I'm inside the world. I cannot tell when or why in a continuum of representative elements, right, of volume, things change, but they do change. And in this kind of weird forest of, you know, having a reference and then losing that reference if you continue with the same way of describing things, and then finding it again, you need to be wary. Like, it's very pragmatic. Like, semantics will change. You need to be aware, and you need to have like your chops ready, and you need to be kind of conscious of this. It seems to be like the perspective from inside a world where this happens, which is slightly different. I mean, a capitalist has a similar engineering problem, which is you need to be aware of where resolutions change, and where, for example, you know, a worker being just too speedy and is just like a personal thing about that guy, and where it becomes actually a relevant resolution for labor intensity, and you can actually evaluate everyone else based on that guy. At some point that changes, and you need to have this very pragmatic, like kind of tools of the man on the go, as Hayek would say. It's very kind of embodied and reacting to changes in this world. The description of why is it at that kind of threshold that this changed and not another one? That's, I think, from the physics of materials point of view, that's a fundamental physics question, right? In the chapter on the natures of scale, that's exactly the first thing Nathal asked, like, why is it that these are the scales, right? Why is it that we're talking about, why is it that Wilson writes about 1 centimeter, 1 millimeter, 1 nanometer? Why not others, right? Not other kind of attractors for the resolution points. I think that's the fundamental physics question. Why these and not others, right? And then you want to have robust enough theory that when those things change, and you can explain why they change, at least kind of get a grip on the, you want to describe the connection between those thresholds and the semantics change. So you need a theory that sees both at the same time. And I think that's what the categorical approach is doing. I think Dennis did it very nicely with this kind of type theory, theoretic kind of counterpoint, because when you change the resolution, what we call the delta resolution, it should affect the kind of space of types or of predicates that are relevant, right? So you're trying to give a general theory of that, but the actual kind of navigating of these problems, it's a pragmatic problem that it's not about why, it's about what you do when that happens, right? Like you don't need to know why 1 millimeter and then 1 nanometer are the relevant kind of approximations. You need to find those approximations and do something about it. I feel like we can actually work better if we just separate those questions, because it seems to me that it makes perfect sense that if you're navigating the world, semantics is your kind of point of holding on to. The question of why the scale is that scale, it's not really the relevant question. You actually get lost in a sort of in principle problem, right? Oh, it should be like this, because that's not really gonna help you. Whereas if you're trying to do the transcendental point of view, then language is not, or the language game or the semantics that goes along with it cannot be the thing you hold on to, because you want to describe the constant changing the things together, or like in Otau's case, which is a bit more concrete, he wants a continuous scale space. He wants you to kind of track a path through that scale, changing like from whatever unit you choose to whatever smaller bits you can go to, and see how that affects your physical description. So the semantics that goes along, right? So in my opinion, there is not really a big conflict there. Perhaps if we just move like, which I think Wilson is very clear about it, like the presupposition is limited beings, limited biological resources, limited brains, doing stuff. If you begin with those assumptions, which are just positioning you in the theory, then semantics is what you have, like the consistency of your semantic space. If it refers to something, if it doesn't refer, if it has consequence, that's the tools you have to see, right? Which is actually fits very well with the primer as well, because how do you know if you capture intensity of labor, a new intensity as a valorizing part? Well, if it gets to be represented in value. If when I look now at the value of the product, I get to say, well, its value was affected because workers worked faster, and then if that's a meaningful statement, you captured something about labor intensity. But it's kind of from the inhabitants' point of view, that's what you get to kind of deal with the problem, right? You don't get to describe it in this abstract sense. It seems like beside the point, right? So I don't know. I see a good kind of transit between the two. You know, I think we just need to. I don't think it's the language thing that makes the two different. I think it's just like perhaps if we define where we're building stuff from, right? Like what perspective are you inhabiting a world that has this connection, scale-dependent semantics, right? Or are you describing what it means for example, a capitalist world to connect semantics, like the value semantics and labor intensity? Like you want to describe that without having to say too much about what are the relevant RVEs, right? Or relevant labor elements or whatever, RLEs. But I feel like perhaps it's a better way to square it, to define the transit between the two, rather than like, is it language based or not? I mean, There's a really, really big part of what we did in the primary. It's like weird predicate logic and this sort of categorical semantics. So I think it fits very, very nicely together.
You know, I don't disagree with that. I was never.
Then it's settled. Great.
No. I was never suggesting a Wilson meeting to criticize the primer or anything like that.
It would be good too, but I like the connection.
I think it's useful. I mean, maybe it's useful. You know? Pedro, do you want to say something? Should we go back?
Yeah, I didn't really understood the thing about like how would Wilson's approach be incompatible with inferentialism, but I just wanted to see that I think that Wilson comes from a very different perspective than Brandon, right? Like Brandon sees concepts as like shared ideals, and Wilson comes from like a much more Quinean perspective, which sees them as like socially instituted cognitive components. And I think that this lends a lot of credence to what you're saying, in the sense of being like very much an embodied view, right? Like he has this sort of like it's really about like situational awareness. And I think that in trying to introduce like the thing about language in the very beginning, he's sort of trying to make the case for how in the real world of like situated embodied agents, the language thing would work, as opposed, or like not as opposed, because I think Brendan doesn't even conceives of this in the same terms, right? Like he's not really concerned with the practicality of the functioning of explanatory strategies, such as the ones that will in the same level of resolution as the ones that Wilson has. So I think that like they would be incompatible, but at very different scales. It was just, you know, like it's more like a question of principles rather than like being compatible or not, in the way that I understand it. But should we keep going?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, because you said something that's very loaded with, so I'm kind of still parsing out, but okay.
Yeah, just to clarify something also, I don't know shit about inferentialism, so I have absolutely no means of saying if something is coherent or not with it. So
no, but I think it's like no, but I think it's good, because I think that like the way that he's treating, like for example, I think what I wanted to say about these like cognitive components is that like the RVE is very much a cognitive component, that it's mediated socially through a community of scientists, right? Like it's not that like I think that the sort of the compatibility is very much in that, is that like maybe it's not really like it's not necessarily given by the scale, because I think he sees it more in purely instrumental terms. But that like, you know, if Brandon would like spawn in our Zoom room, he would just say, well, but you know, they're like, you know, it's instituted by a community of scientists that arrive at this concept in order to make themselves understandable towards each other. So that very much would like sort of bridge the gap between like reality, quotation marks, and the RVs.
Yeah, the problem is that Brandon works with a very thin concept of reality that is correlated to alephic modalities and the deontic modalities that come with them. This is I would make the case that this is actually has more to do with, I mean, the Wilson thing, and the fact that there is a certain kind of material embedding here going on. Of course, you can always relativize to a certain community, and okay, we agree that RVE is a good way to understand this. But I mean, from the point of view of from the engineering proper point of view, I think this is much more fruitfully illuminated by Sellers than by Brandon. And Sellers himself makes it compatible with inferentialism in a sense, because of the problem of the given and all that. But nevertheless, even if you want to avoid the fact that you have like a direct knowledge of this relevant scale, and I don't know, in a sense, you have like there is a superimposition here of two different things. One thing is an empirical engineering problem, which has to do with a certain kind of averaging and reconstitution of a certain multi-layered structure that you can see in reality, okay? But there is also a different problem, which is, so to speak, transcendental problem of coming up with descriptions to things in reality that are not really, I mean, I also uphold Keller's dictum that the categorical structure of the world does not imprint upon the mind as a seal on wax. So it demands labor in order to discover the workings of, you know, the categories that, you know, yield better results in a sense. So this is the Salarzian, actually the Salarzian thing. The Salarzian thing is that just seeing is mute. You have to see as, and see as has to do with a certain kind of experimentation that has to do with certain kind of cognitive powers, or a certain testing of concepts and structures and the relationships and all of that. So what we take as given in that sense is maybe the historical sedimentation of certain successful strategies. So this is the Salarzian dictum. So in a sense, there is a kind of, I mean, there's a possible confusion, of course, between what Wilson is making of an empirical engineering problem and a certain much more general transcendental point of view about language, in a sense. So, but nevertheless, even if there is a couple of levels that we have to differentiate there between a certain empirical engineering problem and a certain transcendental one, I think what Wilson wants to do in the end is also to get some transcendental conclusions out of these empirical problems, in a sense. So this is why he thinks you can map something about this engineering issue of analyzing concrete materials to, you know, different localizations and, you know, different strategies for, you know, robbing a bank and all of these different situations. The problem with language is not that language is impotent. The problem with language is that language seems to be homogeneous, and you don't really, there's no synalization of exactly what you are doing. So this is the whole also Wittgensteinian issue, you see. The point in philosophical investigation is exactly that, because you don't know what you're doing and you don't know how exactly what you are saying, and the non-verbal language games there is such a thing, non-verbal language games that you are playing. How do they hinge? How are they hinged within the world? Makes you come up with a bunch of mistakes in construing the relationship between, you know, understanding and the world you're inhabiting. So I don't really think that language is impotent. I think language is quite the opposite. The problem is not its impotence. The problem is the fact that you don't have a map beforehand. So there is something to be gained in seeing such kinds of engineering problems in order to gain certain certain strategies of knowing your way around within the map of the language you're using, in a sense. So I think this is the Wilson, as I understand him, this is Wilson's contribution, in a sense. What I think is striking about the fact that he portrays himself as an ordinary language philosopher is that, I mean, Wittgenstein was portrayed as an ordinary language philosopher, but I don't think he is. He was one. But I mean, it's not common to see, such treatments of scientific problems and engineering problems within, and see them tethered to a project that portrays itself as ordinary language philosophy. Usually, these have to do with the powers of formalism and, of course, a certain kind of artificialization. So this is what I think is striking, that he's proclaiming himself to be an ordinary language philosopher, which seems that he's saying that there is something to be gained in terms of the understanding of our going about in the world, in the ordinary world, from these applied math problems that he sees in engineering and such. I mean, sorry for the rant.
No, I think this is great, because I think that there's something really interesting about understanding Wilson's term, like work, like sort of trying to like bridge between the sort of like Salarzian or Brandomian thing, but also between like the more sort of like Carnapian stuff of like the sort of like the transcendental conditions of language coming from the logical structure, the logical syntax of language or whatever. But what I think it's really interesting is thinking about the sort of like the guys that Gabriel read recently, Emmanuel Bardon and Lorenzo Magnani. Their approach comes from Dov Gabay and John Woods, which are like sort of two logicians that sort of start taking up the empirical work of archaeologists to try to think the role of technology in reasoning. And I sort of see Wilson doing like very similar things, of like saying that like, well, like there's no such thing as the sort of like the logical structure of language. There are only like contextual, like cognitive structures that are applied within certain practices that are then extrapolated to other language using contexts, and that this is actually the sort of like the really important thing, right? Like it's not so much that there is this sort of like logical structure, but is that like certain forms of inquiry like lend sort of like strategic levers to other forms of reasoning. And I think that this is sort of like it's a really weird like loop around a lot of things, but it sort of like brings Wilson's like relevance, for me at least, as the sort of like true and true agential, like someone that thinks a lot about embodied agents and situated agents. And I think that this is like a really interesting move from Brandon, at least, that the sort of always thinks about the sort of like high level abstraction of like communities and such.
Okay, yeah, this brings me to a certain clarification. I agree with the fact that this is kind of distant to Brandon. For Brandon, I agree with that. The problem is that I don't think Brandon is, of course, strong inferentialism is Brandon's philosophy, but I don't think inferentialism per se is only Brandon. Maybe this would be my, I think, clarifying my position on this issue. Is it compatible or not? I think it's more Salarzian in spirit than Brandomian, because yes, Brandon, it's not like there's
like
no outside
diverges from Sellers in important ways, I think.
Yeah, in what sense?
Well, I just think that, like for Sellers, it's like very much like, how is it possible that like embodied, like real, like how is it that like realism allows us to conceive of like concept mongering animals? Like this is sort of the thing, right? Like how does the causal structure of the world would allow us to have concepts the way that we do? And this actually, I think it's like,
this is a Salarzian problem, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly. And I think that like Brandon's not really concerned with this at all. Like he's just concerned with the types of reasoning that are allowed by concept mongering in the first place, right? Like he has a much more transcendental approach to concept mongering. And I think that but what I think it's interesting about Wilson is like the possibility of bridging between the two sort of approaches in a very much like realist, situated, embodied way.
And you see how, I can see how in the way that Wilson is not upholding, for instance, the difference between a scientific image and a manifest image.
Yeah, for sure.
This is more Brandomian in a sense, but it is also embedded in a certain scientific language that, have a certain kind of apparatus that is trying to, gain traction upon a certain material reality that, Brandom is not really concerned with. He has a semantic theory that, in its generality is supposed to explain also, of course, scientific statements and all that, but it is not really concerned with scientific statements themselves, right? Whereas Sellers puts the stress so much in scientific statements that there's this clash between images. And this is something that Wilson is not agreeing with, it seems, right? So yeah, there's this kind of, this is what I find striking, or I am an ordinary language philosopher that deals with the entities of the scientific image. You see, this is kind of the weird.
No, for sure.
In Wilson, you see, yeah.
But I think that this is also like the really important thing that I thought that when I was presenting my project to you guys in the interview or whatever, like I thought it was like really important to highlight that, like, for Sellers, like both, like the scientific image is the measure of all things, but for him, like science is ultimately a normative endeavor. So like this idea of like the incompatibility between the two images is not even something that Sellers upholds in the first place, right? Like he doesn't really construes it that way. He talks more about like the sort of like the imbrication or like the conception of a human qua human through these questions, right? Like, but he's actually like sort of weirdly making the case for actually we should see like science as normative to understand the process of making scientific progress as embedded in our own agent. I don't know how to say this, but like agent-based thinking.
Okay. Though I've come across a certain interpretation of this issue in Sellers that I find interesting, which is Danielle Macbeth's, and she says something like this scientific image is something that it's composed of entities that we gain access to inferentially. That's all there is to it. The difference. Because you can't really have access to them observationally in the first place. You have access to them inferentially. So right there, also you have like a kind of an answer to Gabriel's first question. Like, what about the RVE? The RVE is a reference that is guiding the investigation. Not really. It's kind of is the detection of a difference of behavior that makes you postulate something there that will explain the difference of behavior, right? So when Sellers says, okay, the scientific image has to do with postulational entities that are not observational, Daniel Macbeth parses this in terms of, okay, these are entities you have inferential access to, but not observational access to, at least in the first moment. For instance, in the molecular theory of gas, and then you get to see those, in a sense, in the microscope, you get to see those entities. But in the first place, you are postulating them as a means of explanation. So this is why it is fundamentally not agreeing with the manifest image. So in a sense, I think this explains a lot, and in a sense also explains the clash, but also mitigates the clash. See, so it's not really like you have two worlds or two ontologies, and we will be reduced to these weird things out there, things like that, right? So it's quite interesting, I think, that Daniel Macbeth's way of thinking about this. Well, we are very, very, very behind now because we of course lashed into big discussions. So I don't really know how to go on with this. What do you think, Pedro? Should we
go to the lessons and try to sort of
the lessons? Yes, because we have a big discussion already about this, right? So there's this section about, you know, a dominant behavior. The dominant behavior is determined by certain descriptive opportunities. For instance, pinning the beam to two positions that are fixed. So this, in a sense, will produce a standing wave, and by this standing wave, you will understand the behavior of the traveling waves. All this physics 101 and everything, but parsing it in terms of heuristic strategy, which is interesting. Then what? Yeah, the dislocation. What's that? Yeah. Something about homogenization methods. I don't really understand the homogenization methods. This is something I wanted to study more, but there's some math there that I have to get into that I don't know about. So,
but maybe, sorry, I wanted to say this, like maybe we can do the lessons, but I found like a bunch of notes that I had taken about homogenization that sort of deal with physics, because that was sort of like, it was sort of the idea that I would write a chapter about scale sensitivity around these things. So I don't know, maybe should we go into homogenization and leave the lessons for another day, or like, I don't know, what would be like a kind of.
I don't know if we have another day. I mean, how are you? I mean, yeah, John already. I think John is supposed to present next week, so I don't know if we have this possibility to continue this next week.
So maybe let's just go to the.
A good question could be, what do you guys think fits better with Giannotti? Because since the last meeting is on Giannotti, it could be expanded like to 2 meetings afterwards. So we could do like John, then go back to this, and then move Giannotti to the next one, like if you want. You see my point? Like leave John.
There's also a meeting about Ludwig's. We were thinking about maybe doing Ludwig's in Giannotti's day, like 3rd of May, and then doing Giannotti next week, because I don't think there's nothing scheduled.
No, nothing scheduled. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like perhaps we could do something like this. Like we leave John next week. He's not here, so we can ask him if he wants this to change. But if he doesn't, or if he's already prepared, after that, there's no schedule, just your meeting and then free. So we could like schedule 2 or 3 meetings in a row, like from Ludwig's, Giannotti, and continue this.
Yeah, it will be a bit forced to directly connect this to Giannotti. I think Giannotti is a kind of thing of its own. I was just going to mention it today as a possible. Yeah, you see, like we have 70 slides, even, you know, time stretching we have here. So yeah, like future elaborations, you see the operational scheme, and the thing is to have like a linguistic approach of atomic logic, in a sense, from the interplay between Marx and Wittgenstein that Giannotti comes up with, which has its limits, of course, but I don't think they are fatal. I think Giannotti is an idiot because he actually didn't continue with that and published a book about Heidegger now. But
I mean, I'm just saying,
just writing him an email. Just like tell him to go back to what he was doing like 50 years ago or whatever.
The guy is old, so I don't think he's interested in that.
My point is just that, I mean, we could ask John if he was okay with postponing, but it seems to me that if we do next week the continuation of this, it would be better to kind of continue along the line and then go to Ludwig's and Giannotti, and then that would mean he would have to postpone like 3 or 4 weeks. So perhaps having him do his presentation and then doing a couple of meetings like more continuously, no matter how we parse the material out, like whatever you guys feel is best. But then it's more continuous and we don't have to postpone him like a month or so.
Should we do the, okay, we can do this. John presents next week because it's already scheduled, if he wants to, of course. And then we'll do how, as Gabriel says, but maybe today Pedro can show us the homogenization thing, because it's already the subject and it's more connected to the problem of Notal and all of that, in a sense. So we keep in this kind of every year about scale, and then the lessons have more to do with language. We can do the lessons, and if there is time, we start Ludix and then go to Gianotti. What do you think, Pedro? Like in 2 or 3 meetings, I mean, contiguous.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's good. I think that like the lessons, like I think it would be like a kind of a cool structure to finish this up with homogenization, and then figure out like how to, if you want to do like Gianotti first or Ludix first, but then to come back at the end with the lessons. Right, like, because I think that like maybe we'll have some sort of like,
yeah, that might work.
Yeah,
that might work. Yeah, well,
yeah, I like that structure.
Yeah, that's good. So I think you will share something, right, Pedro? Then.
Yeah. I'm just gonna talk about like some of the notes that I had, because we didn't really get to, like, I was just coming back to this because. Yeah, like as I was saying, I became really interested in checking out the original Tyranny of Scales text by Mark Wilson, which is in like I think it's like almost 10 years old at this point. It's like from the early 2010s, where he says like, so I'll just run through my notes here real quick, which he says that like a lot of the things that he takes about this homogenization theory is that there's a sort of like, instead of being a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach, is a kind of between scales point of view. And he says that this is very much in depth to renormalization, which is what I'll get into it, which is sort of like this idea in physics that it's that refers to the what allows for a dynamic system to be parsed at different scales, and this leads us to sort of like the idea of decoupling, which is which I take it to be like super important for a bunch of the sort of problems in naturalizing language and in, let's say, things as like agents. And these problems of the description of, like, for instance, like how to reconcile normativity with physicalism or with reductive accounts of science. And so just start with decoupling. So we find that physics at one scale decouples from physics at a second scale. So when these two scales decouple, it means that they're autonomous. So they depend very, very little on each other. So if the physics change at the scale 1, it's very likely that the physics at scale 2 will remain unchanged. So this is sort of like the motivation between these how does he call it, the homogenization practices, right? Like by modeling like aspects or certain areas of like these, like for instance, when he talks about granite and gneiss, it's in very few areas that gneiss is let's say, like, they compromises the structure of the material. So he doesn't really have to model everything as gneiss, because like empirically they know which parts this reorganization of the structure happen. So I think that this is very much related in this idea, right? Like, so what that kind of means is that we don't have to know everything to do physics. We can study physics at the first scale while ignoring physics at the second scale. So the examples kind of vary between like fluid mechanics, that the subatomic structure is ignored. So the particle interactions are left out, and the fluids are studied as a continuum. And in nuclear physics, like things like protons are made of quarks and gluons, but you don't use, or maybe it's too difficult to use quarks and gluons to study these protons. but because of the physics at the level of protons decouples from the physics at the level of quarks, you can ignore the quark interactions. So like another example is like when you're looking at a ball, you sort of ignore many things to track the trajectory of this ball. So you don't really think about the structure of the ball or the like quantum gravity contributions and so on. It doesn't really matter what's happening at a different scale. Like the ball's not going to really change its trajectory very much. It's mostly autonomous. So like maybe the idea being that like because some scale decouples, we're able to define effective field theory. So a theory is effective when it's defined only over some scales, but breaks down, like gives bad results at other scales. So like I think that this is like a really interesting insight in thinking, like if we come back to like maybe like I think the first presentation that I participated, which was Renzo's, like in thinking about integrated information theory as the sort of like theory of how brains work, like, you know, it's like it's really complicated to reintegrate like a normative take on language with like a purely cognitivist theory of mind. So like for me, at least, the validity of these questions that physics allows us to ask, but also that Wilson kind of maneuvers through is like, how then can you, why would you be able to entertain like both possibilities at the same time? And I think that the reason would be that because these scales are decoupled, right? And I think that like there's like a little bit of work in sort of like of making a case of why is that these scales decouple. And I think that this is something like really interesting, but it has to do with the structure of the argument. But in the sort of in this sort of perspective, I think that the question that these effective field theories are dealing with, it's very much relevant to these matters. So like, so I have a bunch of notes about renormalization theory, but like it's really difficult to parse because, as JP said earlier, I also don't have the mathematical savvy to really like understand this. So I think this is really like just trying to figure out in like natural language terms, like how does it work? But as far as I can tell, like our physical theory is a Lagrangian L for the mass M scalar field phi. And we can think about L as providing the equations of motion. At every scale, the terms in L have a coupling constant lambda. So L tells us most everything we need to know about physics at some scale, and the lambda determines how strong the interactions are at each scale. But this is defined like over these arbitrary scales. So if we try to make any calculations, you get like really impossible equations, like really impossible to solve. So there's a sort of, yeah, this sort of like arbitrary cutoff that is set by whoever's doing the modeling, and you sort of renormalize the theory. So this is where it kind of comes from, right? Like from each scale, you move the cutoff a step further in trying to keep the system from giving like these bad results. So this is sort of like how I understand it. But the reason for this, and I think that a lot of recent success in renormalization theory has come from the idea that like this allows us to sort of like keep the physics of our everyday world shielded from physics that we don't really understand yet, or that we don't know how these physics integrate in a continuum manner, or in a sort of like in explanatory continuity. So the idea is that like by doing these moves of homogenization, you get to sort of like shield what we do know from what we don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think Notal, I mean, the connection with Notal would be that it seems like he sort of takes the renormalization approach like seriously. because that it's generally like a way to deal with in your quantum field theories when like infinities come up, right? And how
exactly.
how to scale for them. And it was
exactly.
kind of thought of as this like cheap mathematical trick. But if I'm interpreting it right, I think Hotel has quite a lot of things connecting with it, with this specifically
Yeah,
too.
have a book on it.
Yeah. I haven't gotten that far yet.
Yeah, his point is that
but it seems like he's kind of taking it literally, that these paths actually are infinite, right? So these infinities are real. So then you actually have to be sensitive to the scale, right?
So like the fractal structure, it's given by these like impossible to solve equations. Is that what he's doing and trying to connect them?
Yeah, he actually shows mathematically that fractals do on the opposite direction what renormalization does from, let's say, what renormalization does from bottom to the top, allowing you to forget. Fractal geometry does on the inverse path. So they are method, like he gives the structural backbone to the renormalization process, which again goes back to the thing we were talking about with giving a geometrical meaning to probabilistic treatments, right? Just getting
geometric multi-leveling to a bunch of different scale-sensitive strategies, something like that. So you have both things at the same time. Is that something that approaches what he's doing in a sense?
Yeah, I think so. I'm just trying to find a quote here to send you, but it's way too long for.
I was interested in the cutoff criterion. I don't know if Pedro has something to do about that, because you said an arbitrary cutoff. I don't see how an arbitrary cutoff would yield a good result. Maybe it's completely ignorant. Probably it is a completely ignorant question.
I mean, like I'm also completely ignorant on this. So, like from what I get is that like so to be able to get some answers from this, you have to sort of ignore all, like, I don't know. I think it's basically a work of modeling. Like you sort of establish the cutoffs that give the correct results, right? Like they give the correct empirical results. Like I think that this is how I understand it, right? Like that you have some sort of because like what he saw, like this is very much based on analyzing empirical data from like particle collisions, right? Like you make the particles collide, you extract lots of empirical data, and then you use this empirical data to run the models so that you have something to compare to, right? Like, so I think that the arbitrary cutoff would be to sort of to get the system to behave how we expect it to behave.
You know? I mean, you mean cutoff in the sense that the cutoff is between what you're considering and what you will not consider. It's not the cutoff between scales.
I think. It's not a cutoff between scales.
RVE levels. No, it's not about that.
No.
Like the cutoff is like I won't open further the black box. This is the cutoff.
Yeah, I would assume so.
And there's a degree of arbitrariness to that.
Here, can I share a screen really quickly? I think this is a good point here of connection. Yeah, he says that to talk like renormalization and this sort of mini scale of length approach is one of the best kind of scale dependent techniques in physics, right? Then he shows a connection between a renormalization group equation where this, I don't know how it calls, like small delta, right? is an anomalous dimension. He shows how this is connected with scale divergence. Like there's a direct kind of resonance between the two equations. So he says that this is a distinction between him and his approach and the renormalization approach. I think it's relevant. And I think it's a good point to also bring up a concrete problem that we have on politics. He says, renormalization group approach consists in describing a system at a small scale, for example, an ensemble of elementary quantum spins, then dilating the system by some scale factor and looking at the way the various quantities have changed. Up to the renormalization group transformation, one is brought back to the previous problem and may iterate the process. One may then reach scales very large with respect to the initial ones, in a logarithmic rather than linear way. But when going from one scale to the next, one usually replaces the information on the system by an average, so that it is impossible to come back to the smaller scale. In other words, there is no inverse transformation in the renormalization group. It's only a semi-group, right? On the other hand, fractals usually build from the larger scale to the smaller. One defines a generator and builds smaller and smaller structure by successive application of the generator after rescaling. So fractals may actually come as an inverse transformation for the renormalization group. And I mean, he goes a lot into this afterwards. But just to, I mean, this is a good quote from the book, Fractal Space-Time in Microphysics, towards a theory of scale relativity. It's like a whole chapter on the connection between the two approaches.
That's really interesting.
Just want to give GP like a better description, which is like this arbitrary cutoff. It's called a Wick rotation, which is a method to find a solution to a mathematical problem in a Minkowski space from a solution for a related problem in an Euclidean space by means of a transformation that substitutes an imaginary number variable for a real number variable. So I think that the sort of like arbitrariness comes from this substitution for like generating a way of making this substitution.
Wait, what's this called again?
Wick rotation.
Okay, just gonna look it up.
Wick rotation.
Wick. I'll just write it down real quick.
The reason why I said
like John Wick.
The reason why I said that this is actually, it would be nice to connect this to some other problem, is that, you know, in political economy, we have a similar issue, which you can find clearly in Marx, which is the moment that he changes the scale of analysis, he always introduces the idea of an average, like socially necessary labor time. Well, that's the average time a worker needs. And once you arrive at that, you can no longer see what, you can no longer come back, right? This sort of, again, there's this weird change from a sort of logical approach to a sort of average, like the mediation through averaging to arrive at a new level of description, right? This has led to, I mean, this is common because, for example, it's easy to describe there's a sort of nice analogy. Like if you talk about a workplace, you can talk about people interacting in almost classical sense, right? But when you talk about big movements of capital, you talk about probabilities, you talk about statistics, and very kind of sophisticated kind of recent Marxist ideas to describe average rate of profit, equalization logics for how different rates of profit can become kind of equal among society, among sectors of capitalist departments. They move to this probabilistic approach to show that you can, that's actually one that gets to capture the relevant determinations rather than this sort of deterministic approach that Marx seems to suggest, or that seems proper to describe lower levels of analysis, right? And it's a good, it's interesting. It seems like it's okay. It's an okay solution, but it always leads you to the sort of it makes you lose the sort of ground, right?
Masking the ground. You're masking the process that give rise to the new scale in a sense.
Yeah, and then it's a reason why, even though capital goes from the analysis of production to the analysis of circulation to the analysis of global capitalism as a whole, which is book 3, right? In book 3, describing the sort of totality of capital and the partition of total capital, he introduces the common notions: profit, demand and supply, prices of production, and things like this, which are recognizable. But you don't get to, it's kind of missing the explanation as to why, on the daily life of people in capitalism, you don't get to describe, like, if you want to give a global description of your place in the world, you describe the world with these categories, not the categories of value, labor, and so on. Like, it's hard to make sense of them, even though they are the building blocks that allow you to have the logical description of this more probabilistic, like equilibrium dynamic things. It seems like there's a weird threshold where, even though they're foundational, they lose their meaning. So it's nice to also, I mean, be very explicit about, like, what's the sort of structure that requires you or is kind of mobilizes this other way of describing things, right? Like averaging things, or seeming like it's easier to describe things as sort of complex, dynamic, where people are just interacting, and this gives rise to weird effects like supply and demand curves, and that's just it, you know. So I don't know, there's a nice connection between a problem that is actually getting more attention these days than it did in the past, between the tools that Marx uses to move between levels of analysis of capital, you know, and this sort of issue of why it seems like when you move, like the very common strategy for moving from one level of analysis to another in other fields, it's also finding the proper way of, the meaningful way of doing an averaging of something, to kind of an averaging as a way to forget something that becomes meaningless in that context, you know. Like, that could also be a useful discussion more generally, I think. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, that's also, I think this like averaging concept in mathematics plays like a really central role, where basically everything, I mean, just equivalence classes, general, right? That's basically everything in math, is when you look at an object in different ways, right? You can look at an object geometrically, algebraically, topologically. So I think it's connected also.
But this is what I want to get at. Like,
as well.
Don't you think that it's interesting that in category theory, you have a concept of forgetting or abstracting away, which is not really an averaging strategy, right? I mean, this sort of losing of information from the standpoint of a perspective, right? You build some object from the diagrammatic or the logical commutative properties that object is entangled with. Some things are no longer relevant, so you lose that information to gain consistency. But that's a strategy that usually requires you to make that move from, for example, from deterministic to non-deterministic, or from simple to complex, right? It's usually very kind of committed to other ideas. It's not a pure idea, like it's not a separate operation on its own. It's usually like the effect of treating probabilistically something that you cannot really access, or it's not interesting to access it directly, right? So you get it kind of, you get the same sort of idea, but removed from all the added machinery.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the idea of equivalence in any context or category, right? You knowing what does it mean for two things to be equivalent. It's like the same thing for this thing idea we keep harping on about, like the difference that makes a difference, right?
Yeah.
And
it's the same idea.
The other part of that is anytime you forget information in category theory, there's probably like the notion of a junction lying in the background, which is how you would complete the stuff that was lost, right?
Yeah.
So if you remember that simple example we were talking about way back, we were talking about adjunctions, like if you have the natural numbers and you have a function that squares every natural number, obviously there's no inverse because there's not a square root of every, there's not a square root of everything that you could produce, right?
No, just for the integers or real numbers, but yeah.
Yeah, for the integers, right? So the adjunction would be how you would choose an inverse to that function that lost some information, right? It's kind of like
complex numbers, right?
Yeah, and then you kind of expand your original space so that you can allow for like the square root of 2, for example.
Yeah, I don't want to take up. I mean, but I just thought that's a nice example. You know, like the renormalization seems to be a practical strategy for kind of coming up with a new homogeneous, consistent level of description. But this idea that it doesn't have this inverse, right? Once you lose that information, it's connected with so many other changes that you can't really go back, right? And the reason why I'm saying this is because in that book by Robert Rosen on his approach to theoretical biology through category theory, that's his argument, that you don't want to describe the forgetfulness of aspects of a material through complex system or dynamic system analysis. Like that shouldn't be the biologist's tool, because you're required to make so many other commitments that the fact that biological creatures, they can come to be affected by things that they forgot. They can become meaningful again, right? You want that to be kind of you want the tools that describe this organization of the living creature to not be committed to the fact that things you forgot when you moved to some other descriptive level cannot be kind of come to play a part at that level at some point, you know? So I think that there's a nice kind of interplay between category theory and complex analysis at this point. But again, it's in the point, but not really exactly on topic.
Pedro, I just wanted to ask, where did you read this stuff connecting the homogeneity and renormalization things? Is this in the Mark Wilson text?
So it's a little bit in the original Tyranny of Scales article, but the physics stuff comes from a text that I can share later in the group, which is called Renormalization for Philosophers.
Oh yeah,
and John Baez's blog post.
Oh, John Baez. Oh, nice. Okay.
Oh, John Baez.
Yes.
Yeah, he's cool. He's very involved in category theory and stuff as well.
Yeah. I mean, he's the one guy that is at a university that I know Henry Flint discussed with. I mean, I remember his name from talking to Henry Flint, which is this maverick, really weirdo, basically philosopher. And John Baez is one guy that is actually talks to Flint, which is kind of a virtue. Yeah.
That's a crazy connection.
Maybe they know each other through Joan, of course.
Yeah, Joan presented both. Yeah.
No, because you know Flint. Yeah. No, let me get started with Flint. Let's tombe, whatever. But yeah. Go on, Pedro. Do you want to continue?
No, that's pretty much it.
Okay. Should we wrap it up? I don't know. I mean, this got in a sense unstructured. I mean, because we had like 70 different slides, but every single time we get caught in such discussions that anyway, but don't know, maybe we should go on as we talked before, like after John, you can talk about Ludwig's, and then I go to Gianotti, and then if we have time, we read these lessons, go back to this by the end of this arch, maybe.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, I think that would be cool. Yeah.
No, I mean, because I have a sort of intuitive sympathy for how Wilson describes homogenization, but it's one thing that I was unclear about is that there seems to be three things that move together. But since you looked into this, it would be nice to if you could elaborate a bit more, which is there is this sort of, we would even say four things that are moving together. Like you want to find the appropriate kind of way of talking about a phenomena, because one of the criteria for it to be the appropriate one is that it kind of latches on, still manages to latch on, which is a very kind of slippery thing, right? He has a very sort of slippery theory of reference. Still manage to latch on to some reference. Like if you speak about it this way, you're talking about something, right? Whereas if you continue to talk about it that way for a slightly different phenomena or slightly different situation, you might have lost your reference, right? So that seems to be the first thing, like the sort of latching on to the slippery reference thing. The second is like that this seems to be connected with consistency, but in a very complicated way, because being consistent is precisely, as Caron was saying, like language can play tricks, because if you confuse linguistic consistency and rational consistency, you might be moving beyond, generalizing a way of speaking beyond that reference and letting it slip out, right? So there's something about consistency that comes into play there that seems relevant, like at the conceptual level, perhaps. Then there is this homogenization thing, which seems a bit more technical, though he talks about it in a way that doesn't seem to apply only to formalisms or to a formal treatment of things, which is a bit unclear exactly like what gets homogenized. And then ultimately there is like the big kind of example of this, which seems to be, the renormalization approach, right? I mean, I just added a bunch of things, but if you could perhaps elaborate on how they go together, or like, especially the homogenization, like I think that's the good place to start. It seems to imply something concerning consistency, but it's not clear to me.
Well, I think it's more like, it's sort of like the way that I understand it, at least, especially in relation to the renormalization group stuff, is that like the homogenization, it's really about like limiting what can be said about each scale, and like in terms that you can then sort of reintegrate with the rest of the structure, right? Like there isn't really, I think I just want to open the physics avoidance to look into this, but what I remember is that like I think that what he's saying is that, especially because I think that the lesson that he talks about the homogenization, mostly it's 4, and that he says that like you have to use very specific, like he says, like specific linguistic locutions to help listeners follow its altering context correctly, and to sort of be able to connect everything together. And I think that this is the thing, that the example that he gives is, he even mentions consistency actually, which is, he says something like, the varying stages within a stretch of multiscalar reasoning can be highlighted as follows. Let us now convert our recrystallization data in terms that our higher order model can understand. And the second one is, what?
What's the page you're reading from?
It's from lesson 4 from our presentation, if you want to pull that up.
Oh, the presentation, yeah, because I have physics avoidance here, so yeah. So from the presentation.
I didn't have, but I think that this is like a really nice example that I think it sort of addresses what Gabriel asked us, which is sort of like, so he puts like the varying, like, I don't think it's the varying, it's like really two stages, but it's like you sort of convert because this is relative to granite and gneiss, right? Like that gneiss is a granite that have been recrystallized because of stress. So he's talking about like being able to pinpoint where this process happens, so that you can incorporate that, like where, the size, and how it's distributed over the material, in order to bring this back into the calculations that take into consideration the structure of granite. And then he says that first you convert the data into terms that your higher order model can understand, and then you repeat, like checking for consistency over and over until you have a stable result across the scales. So I think that what he's talking about in terms of consistency and homogenization is actually the data that is produced by specific computations in relation to modeling each scale. So then he follows with these questions, which I think it's like, and he's doing this all in like the structure of questions, right? Like, let us now ask what upper scale effects will be caused by the lower scale recrystallization, and let us now consider what becomes true on a higher length scale as granite recrystallizes. So I think that this is really the way in which both consistency and homogenization are brought into the fold, because they're like different sides of the same process, right? Like, ideally, the process of homogenization yields consistency by reintegrating the specific, because like I think that what I think it's maybe lost in this explanation is that like this question of recrystallization is really only ever present in very specific parts of the material. So it's something that can be like synchronized without having to calculate a lot of it, right? Like it's just really small instances of the material that behave in this way.
I think it's quite striking that he says that homogenization has to do with the way scales talk to each other, in a sense. Like,
yeah,
it's not that there is no internal consistency. There is a certain consistency to each scale. Otherwise, you wouldn't arrive at an RVE and a description of its specific behavior. But you have to filter this information in order to be visible from the other scale. He uses kind of this this metaphor of the scales communicating to each other. And if you, let us say, communicate as it is the consistency of a scale to the other one, it seems that there's a lot of clutter, there's a lot of noise. And he says something that I find very striking, but I have a kind of hard time parsing what it means to do that in the mathematical terms, in the applied math terms, which has to do with the fact that for instance, from the point of view of the macro scale, those shifts of behavior in the micro scale looks like blurred things. There's a kind of blurry quality to that. That becomes defined, determined as you approach a different resolution, of course.
I mean, it looks a lot like what that analytic condition of atoms for Badiou, right? That you found an atomic predicate if underneath it two different things are indistinguishable, right? It's a blurring, right?
The blurring is a blurring, and he talks about homogenization in terms of you have to, in your model, replicate the way
that one scale is seen from the other one. So there is a degree of blurriness to that scales that have, you know, determinate behaviors that are non-identical to the ones of the other scale. So this blurriness should be should be in a sense retained, simulated by your model, and because then you are kind of being able to look at your whole model from the point of view, from a certain point of view that you, this much I didn't understand quite well, because it seems there is a choice of scale. I'm not sure how this is done, but it seems there is a choice of scale from which you are, in a sense, looking the whole model, in a sense. So it's not simply to transfer the information that is present in the other scale to the one you chose as a criterion, but to reconstruct the view from that scale in terms of its fuzziness as well, its fuzziness, its blurriness as well, in a sense, a degree, like a calculated degree of fuzziness, of blurriness, in a sense. So I think it's a quite interesting thing to think about, but I don't really know the specifics of how to do this. There's this blowing up issue, right? To blow up a certain behavior by approaching the RVE size to 0, and considering it like an infinite population, and maintaining the same behaviors in the surfaces, in the areas and the surfaces, at the same time approaching asymptotically 0, you know, the RVE to 0 or something like that, and then rereading the whole model on that criterion. So, but this is very, very far away from really understanding what's at stake. So I was trying to read some technical stuff about it, but it demands a lot of previous knowledge of how these things work.
Yeah, I think the way that I don't understand it, like the point that it seems to me that it's a good place to see the move from the sort of transcendental general discussion of this to the sort of specific problem, is that the whole point is, what does it mean in a physical theory, in physics, to treat things indistinguishably, right? So you don't, it's not a matter of talking about it indistinguishably. So natural language, you could say, look at the molecular level. Some particles are moving this way, some particles are moving that. It's a very mass heterogeneous field. Well, what can you say in general? Well, you can say in general they're moving, right? Or you can say they're moving with this property or not. I mean, that's the homogeneous description of a very heterogeneous process. But that's not really doing physics yet, right? What you want to do, yeah. So what you want to do is, and I think that's where the issue of the averages are relevant, because that's a strategy for producing rigorous mathematical statements that capture some properties rather than others of a system in a way that now it looks like you're just cutting off, like you're establishing a threshold of what is heterogeneous but irrelevant, because on the whole, right, you get this general property, and then you substitute the information about the heterogeneous system for, which it can be totally intractable, right, for a tractable, simpler, let's say, description of a property that holds.
Yeah, you choose there's a considered degree of blurriness there, because then you are not falling into the problem of intractable quantities from the point of view of your average scale that you chose. But at the same time, it's not the opposite. It's not like there's some stuff moving there. Like it's not that. You're still capturing some relevant behavior, right? And it seems to be like a trade-off between these two things. Not too much to the point that it becomes noise from the point of view of your macro scale, but not too little to the point of being uninformative. Oh, there's a bunch of stuff there.
Yeah, and I think that's how transcendentally we move from the analytic to the synthetic condition, because the synthetic condition says atoms shouldn't only make things indistinguishable or blurred between a certain threshold, but that blurriness needs to increase your implicative structure. For example, water is boiling. You can describe it analytically, very heterogeneously, by talking about the very messy situation of water molecules, but you can't really entail much from that, right? Nothing follows from it necessarily, right? Depending on the sort of analysis you're doing. Whereas if you're talking about boiling water, which is, let's say, the averaging higher scale behavior of the system, you can talk about the fact that the water, the boiling pot is getting hot together with it, or like that information remains, because that averaging behavior of they speeding up the molecules has some interaction with the metal in the pan or whatever recipient you have. That has some effect, and so on and so forth, right? So you don't simply want to forget. There is a very important connection between forgetting and enriching, right?
Exactly.
But enriching in the logical sense, right?
You have to forget as a means to understand, like as a means to enrich your description.
Yeah, and not every analytic procedure. Right now, not every analytic procedure will increase this synthetic richness, right? So it seems like that's the trade-off. But then again, I think the third condition is, which we call like the materialist condition, right? It's not enough to simply do these two things if they imply losing some relation to a reference. You want this to keep a hold on the reference, right? Because there are interesting metaphors that allow you to change. For example, Juliet is the sun. That's a metaphor, right? You're treating Juliet as if it's on par with astral bodies and stars. And you can make implicative statements. Therefore, I am like the moon or like the earth. I mean, you're creating a rich language based on a weird forgetting of differences. But it's not, it's a metaphor because it purposely loses track of the reference. You cannot guarantee that by following that implicative structure, you can get back to the material at stake, right? At some point I will say, oh my God, so Juliet it has solar flares. No, that makes no sense with the metaphor. Like that's not the point, right? You make statements that have no counterpart.
Yeah, unless solar flares means another thing, which means it's another metaphor.
Exactly, and you lose something. So it's nice to, I mean, you need the 3 points, right? An analytic kind of creating homogeneous and, let's say, forgetful predicates that are, on the other hand, synthetically relevant. They enrich your implicative description of the world, but that implicative description still, I mean, and that's where I think the dangers of language, like this overpotency that you talked about, rather than its weakness, comes in. Because if you just trust the syntactic aspect of language, it can actually...
I agree with that.
Right?
This overpotency is a problem. I mean, but it's not really a problem of weakness. It's a problem of overpotency.
Yeah, exactly. It's too strong. Like it can make too many implications, right?
And it can almost anything in language. Like this is, come on. I mean, and this is the whole. I mean, if you go back to philosophy of language, to Wittgenstein, to all that thing that I studied for years, it has to do with that. Like you lose track of what's going on because language is seamless in its surface. So you see like words and sentences, and the sentences are alike. And language games sometimes are alike or seem to be alike, and they are not. For some detailed difference, there is some detail that is different between them, among them, that makes all the difference. So yes, it's danger. The danger of language is a kind of form of it. It comes from its overpotency in a sense.
Yeah, and I think that this is a nice kind of way to introduce this kind of wandering significance, this slippery referent problem, because that's a third category, right? That's a third condition. You have the analytic, the syntactic, but the syntactic is not really the end of. I think that's, if I understand the debate you guys were proposing between Wilson and other inferentialists, is that inference is actually the syntactic. It doesn't guarantee the material. Whereas being aware of the slippery aspect requires you to treat it as a third thing, right? So you need to keep track of some indexing of the syntactic on the material.
Okay, that's good. It's like you could reconstruct random as saying something like the syntactic condition is sufficient to guarantee reference.
Yeah, something like this. That's how I understood it, is what you said there.
Yeah, random is something like that. Sellers is not like that. So yeah, there's that. And but then sellers has sellers has this ambiguous position that, you know, sustains like this clash of images, that there's a bunch of different interpretations on that. I like Daniel Macbeth's one, as I said. There's still reference. You were tracking down a reference through the inference. So it's still a different thing. It's not like in random, the synthesis is sufficient for the reference, but you know, the synthesis, the previous synthesis you did.
Wait, just can I ask something real quick? Reference in which way?
You're asking me, or
I'd say in the linguistic way. I mean, the referent, you know, like in the Freudian sense.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, just because I was thinking that, like, for sellers, this is really dependent on picturing, right?
Yeah. I was also avoiding this issue, but yeah, it is dependent on picturing. Yeah. Oh, which means it has to do with perception, language entry transitions, and all that. I mean, paradigmatically, it has to do with language entry transitions. But at the same time, there is this weird issue because, you know, in the scientific image, you are dealing with postulated entities, so you're not seeing them. You are inferring from what you see a certain behavior that will explain what you see. And this is entangled with the space of reasons, but it tracks also a reference, it tracks a behavior, right? So there is picturing going on, but it is kind of a second order picturing. This is a interesting thing. So it seems that the difference between what the objects in the manifest image that are observational and the objects in the scientific image which are postulational science, as he talks about, seems to be a difference between first order and second order picturing, in a sense. And picturing is there in a sense in the role of sensation, like. But yeah, it's kind of a logical. There's a logical infrastructure to that. It's a fairly complicated issue, picturing. So this is why I was.
But you know what's interesting? Like,
I think we could cut off picturing. You know, it's just to understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reference. I mean, but you never uses that word, right? For him, postulated materialism just means that if you have syntactic powers from the perspective of some atomic logic, that you should be able to translate it through this transcendental functor thing back onto the parts of the world. So it's, let's say, the move from logic back to geometry, right? It's a move to the topology of the space kind of approach.
And it has a lot to do with this. I mean, you could map this onto the Salesian framework because picturing has to do also with a kind of topology of geometrical thing. You know, it's not. It's like it is also like a conversion process between a kind of isomorphism that is tracking down some natural object through another natural object, be that can be a trace, it can be sound, whatever means you have that gets entangled in a logical space of reasons. So there's a picturing, the picturing relation is not really in the language, you see, it's like a condition for the language.
So there is a lot of different. This is why I'm interested. Also, this is you're touching upon the core of what's interesting me a lot in Badiou from what everything that we studied last year. There is something to be gained in this comparison, and yeah, but I mean, I would cut off today picturing because it's quite complicated matter. But anyway, there is an interesting. Yeah, there's an interesting possibility there also of a connection to what Badiou is doing. But
it clarifies a lot for me, like the way you guys are presenting. It really helps.
Yeah, but
yeah, me too.
It's something like this. For Brandon, a synthesis guarantees reference because you triangulate between the units doing the synthesis. Like the units doing the synthesis are the subjects that are part of the space of reason. If you're triangulating, like they are agreeing upon the synthesis they are doing, this is a sufficient condition for asserting that there's something there. But there's a quite weird thing that you don't have really a guarantee, a fine-grained guarantee that the referees of the terms that two people use in the Brandonian framework are really the same. They are functionally the same for all relevant purposes. They are the same. It's like there's a cutoff right there in a sense. It doesn't matter if they are the same or not. They are functionally the same. Whereas Sellers is not construing this like that. It has also a kind of language entry transition. And I'm using language entry transition in order to avoid the difference between the species of language entry transitions, one of which will be picturing, because I don't want to delve into that now, but because it's quite complicated. But you have language entry transitions as a cognitive also requirement. You have to have that. So perception and sensation, and also surrogate perception, so to speak. Like you don't see the molecules, but you see the gas, and you postulate the molecules in order to explain the behavior of the gas. It's kind of a surrogate perception, so to speak, like a second order perception. I don't perceive what I'm postulating, but I postulate this in order to explain what I perceive. And Sellers is so radical to the point that this is going on introspectively as well. Like, I don't know what thoughts are for Sellers. I don't know ontologically what thoughts are, but I'm modeling my thoughts upon overt linguistic expressions. So I can ascribe to myself an intention, like a kind of finality to my actions. But this is not an ontological discourse of what thoughts are. I don't know what thoughts are. I will know with, completed neuroscience or something like that, which is quite an interesting division of labor that's going on in Sellers' philosophy. I mean, Sellers is much more interesting than Brandon, in my opinion. But yeah.
So should we if we're not going into picturing, should we?
Yeah. Pedro?
Yeah, we can wrap it up.
Yeah. I think it's okay. It's good.
Guys, it was really clarifying. Like, it was really cool.
We'll see what we do schedule-wise then in the group. So
okay, we can talk about it there.
Yep. Okay.
Great, guys.
All right.
Thank you.
Bem, eu vou ter mais texto para falar português, tá? Tchau.
Valeu.
Valeu, gente. Beijo.
Valeu, gente.